Okay, I know you guys are joining, and thank you again. We're so excited to have you guys here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just a reminder, this presentation will be recorded. Um, so today, we're just so excited to come together and think about how children are evaluated for ADHD. And so thank you again for coming. And again, sorry for the link not initially working. So first, we want to introduce ourselves a little bit, and I'm going to have Dr. Monahan lead us off, and then I'll talk a little bit about me.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excited to have this conversation. My name is Leigh Monahan, and I've been at the Family Institute for a little over 2 years. And I am a staff therapist as well as a testing psychologist here at the Family Institute.
Thanks, Lee. I'm Dr. Stacey Austin, and I have been working with children for a little over 10 years. I am providing parent-child play therapy services, parent coaching, as well as doing some evaluations. Again, we're so excited to have you here. So to kind of give you a little sense of what we're going to be doing today, I am first going to be talking about ADHD more generally, kind of symptoms and signs, and some associated features. Then Dr. Monahan is going to talk a little bit more about what to expect during an ADHD evaluation, how you can collaborate with your child's school, and then kind of next steps of what to do after an ADHD evaluation and how you can kind of support your family and your child. But first, we're going to do a fun activity, and feel free to move around any way that you need to, so that way you can participate in this activity. Essentially, I'm going to give you 4 tasks to do at the same time. Your goal is to remember them and complete them all in just 1 minute. I'm going to keep track of the time, and I just ask that you try your best and have fun with it. And again, I'm going to give you 4 tasks, and then after the minute, I'll let you know, and then we'll kind of like check in about it. So I'm going to get us started. Whisper the spelling of your first name backwards. Touch 4 objects in the room that are black. Stack 3 items on your desk as fast as you can. Name 5 animals in your head and write the third one down. Okay, you can stop there. And so I think maybe some of our first questions, right, are what was your reaction to that? Maybe what stood out to you? You might have felt overwhelmed or confused or wish I had given more warning or repetition or that you could ask questions about what I was asking you to do. Or maybe you're like, I don't have a piece of paper or I don't have something to write with right by me. I don't know where those materials are right now. This task requires you to be able to hold these complex instructions in mind, right? To shift your attention between these different tasks. And it requires a lot of executive functioning, right? That kind of holding instructions in mind, kind of your working memory to be able to complete it. And what we find is that kids with ADHD often have challenges with this, right? And even though they're trying really, really hard to complete the task that we're asking them to do, that some of these things kind of get in the way to be able to do so. And so we really wanted to have this activity as a way for us to maybe experience what it can feel like when a child with ADHD is given a lot of directions and doesn't have supports of being able to ask repetitions or questions or have more time. And so we can talk more about this as we go, but just wanted to first kind of highlight that. So generally, ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a persistent pattern of inattention and we'll talk a little bit about that and or next, um, of hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. And so that could mean it's interfering, pardon me, with school or social relationships, their academics. And so kind of some of the areas, right, that inattention, that first part can kind of manifest as having a hard time paying attention to like maintaining their focus during activities, play, maybe during a long lecture. They might miss key items when doing homework, like missing an important part of directions. They might lose things that are necessary to do a task, like glasses or notebooks, and generally just struggle to be organized. The hyperactivity, I kind of, broke up hyperactivity and impulsivity. The hyperactivity can really look like having a hard time staying seated when you're expected to be still, like leaving your seat in the classroom or being at a restaurant and not being able to stay at the table. Really kind of always moving, fidgeting, touching something. Um, Always being really talkative, right? Could be how hyperactivity can manifest. Impulsivity can look like blurting out answers, intruding into other people's space, starting to play with something someone else has without first waiting to hear if they have permission to do so. They can have a really hard time waiting their turn. This is not an exhaustive list, right? But it's a way for us to kind of hold in mind what ADHD can look like for children. I think a really important thing to be thoughtful about when we're thinking about ADHD is that it can manifest as predominantly inattentive, right? That it can be that what you're seeing for your child is that they're only presenting with those inattention symptoms, like having a hard time staying focused or completing multiple step directions, right? They kind of get derailed halfway through. Or it can be more predominantly hyperactivity or impulsivity, right? Intruding in other people's space, um, not being able to do a activity quietly, right? Not waiting and just kind of getting started on something. Or it can be really a combination of both. And so we see both of those areas be a challenge for a child. And so when we're giving a diagnosis of ADHD, we'll often talk about, is this more inattention? Is this more hyperactivity, impulsivity? Or is it a combination of both? Another important fact about ADHD is, right, it begins in childhood. And the diagnosis requires that there's several symptoms present before someone is 12. That doesn't mean that you cannot be evaluated for ADHD after 12, but we're going to be curious about how your attention and activity level was prior to 12. Symptoms of ADHD really need to be present in more than one setting. For example, we need to see a child having a hard time with some of these areas in like school, at home, maybe home and other activities, but that it's happening in more than one place. Some other associated features that we see for kids with ADHD is they have a really hard time with emotional dysregulation. They're like easily maybe frustrated. They might really overreact at times, and that they can really struggle with those executive functioning skills that we talked a little earlier about. Working memory, like holding directions in mind, and then being able to kind of follow those directions. Keeping things organized or planning out how they're going to complete something. And that what we often find is that children with ADHD often have an impact on their social relationships, right? They might have a hard time making friends or sustaining friendships. And so we want to be really thinking about some of these areas when we're thinking about how we can best support kids with ADHD. Some other things when we're thinking about ADHD is that over time, it can look a little bit different, right? That when a child with ADHD kind of shifts into adolescence and adulthood, we might see that hyperactivity shift a little bit more to like internal restlessness or impatience or kind of this internal feeling of like jitteriness, as opposed to a lot of outward signs, like observable signs of hyperactivity. But we still see kind of inattention, difficulty with planning, impulsivity. But that hyperactivity can look a little bit different as kids get older. ADHD is diagnosed more frequently in males than females. And that what we find is that girls with ADHD often are presenting with more of that inattention that we talked a little bit earlier, as opposed to the hyperactivity. However, that's not always the case, but we often see that presentation for girls with ADHD. Children with ADHD also have a higher risk of academic difficulties. They often get in trouble more, and they don't always feel so great about themselves. They can get a lot of negative feedback about their performance or how they're doing things, right? Because of some of their impulsivity and difficulties planning and organizing. We also can see some children with ADHD have other diagnoses that are kind of co-occurring, right? And that we are going to be thinking a little bit about. This is not always the case, right? But sometimes children with ADHD have anxiety, depression, learning disorders, just to name a few. But that we really want to be holding this whole child in mind and thinking about some of these different areas when we're doing evaluations and thinking about treatment moving forward. So I've just talked a lot about some of the areas of challenge for children with ADHD, but they have a lot of strength as well. And like they can really be focused on things that they're really passionate about, bring a lot of energy to like group projects, and have a lot of creativity. I read a study where it was two groups of kids in college. One group were students with ADHD, and the other group did not have ADHD. And they were asked to come up with, create a fruit that you could find on an alien planet. And what they found was that the students with ADHD were far more creative in the designs that they made, and had a lot more out of box thinking. That their designs did not resemble fruit that you could find here and like Earth, right? Like what you're normally seeing, right? They were coming up with things that were really highly creative, right? And so we really want to be able to celebrate children's strengths, right? And how we can use them to help them feel their best, right? So celebrating their strengths and providing support can really help kids feel their best and do well at school. We also wanted to talk a little bit about some common myths that we hear a lot when we're thinking about ADHD. Just to kind of, because there's a lot of information out there. One of the myths is that some people think that ADHD is only a problem for children and that it will go away. And what we know is that ADHD changes over time, but that they still would have ADHD, right? Like that kind of idea of the hyperactivity might become more internal, kind of restlessness, and it might look a little bit different, but they still would have ADHD. Another myth that we've heard is that children need to have symptoms of hyperactivity to be diagnosed with ADHD. And kind of like what we talked a little bit earlier about is that you can have ADHD that's predominantly inattentive, right? Or predominantly hyperactive. So the hyperactivity is not required to have a diagnosis of ADHD. Another kind of thing that we hear sometimes as well is children with ADHD can't focus on anything for a long period. But actually, what we know is that children with ADHD can focus on things that they typically find really highly rewarding or they're passionate about. It might even become a little hyper focused on those things. Another thing, right, is that ADHD and ADD are two different disorders. Well, in reality, ADD is actually an older term, attention deficit disorder, that was used to kind of describe the inattentive presentation of ADHD. Now, the diagnosis, the current kind of wording that we use is ADHD, to kind of describe um, this presentation. And then we would be specific about, is it predominantly inattention? Is it predominantly hyperactivity, impulsivity, or a little bit of both? So I'm going to have a shift over to Dr. Monahan, and she's going to talk a little bit more about how ADHD is diagnosed using an evaluation and kind of what to expect after the evaluation.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Austin. So if any of those things were sounding familiar to you as Dr. Austin was talking about ADHD, you may be wondering if it's appropriate to seek out an actual diagnosis. One thing I do like to point out is we all have some of those symptoms at certain times. That's just part of the human condition. What we look at when we're actually deciding if an individual meets criteria for the diagnosis is, are those symptoms there, and is it having a functional impact on their lives? So, there's three primary ways that you might be able to learn more about this for your child and get a diagnosis or support in school. The first is a more medical route. Some pediatricians or psychiatrists will give the diagnosis and do feel comfortable assessing for it. Typically, that's going to include interviews and rating scales to get a sense of what are the behaviors that are impacting the child in the home and the school setting. Um, Folks often pursue this route if they're looking primarily for medication management. And it can give good information, but as you'll see, it's not going to give as comprehensive of an understanding as some of these other routes might be. The second route you can go, which we'll talk most about today, is a neuropsychological evaluation. So, like I mentioned, this is a more comprehensive understanding of your child's cognitive strengths, their weaknesses, and what I think is most important in giving more targeted um, recommendations for your child to help them build on their strengths. The third route you can go is going through the school. One thing that I do like to highlight is school professionals do actually not diagnose ADHD. Through the education legislation known as IDEA, kids are guaranteed a free and appropriate education. And so schools are obligated to assess in one way or another, and that can look very different depending on your child's presentation and their needs. But they're going to primarily focus on what's the impact on your child's education. So they're primarily going to answer two questions. One, do they have a disability? Do they meet that criteria for that classification? The law has 13 different areas outlined that a child can meet criteria for. And two, does it rise to the level of the need for special education? And we'll talk more about this later as we go through the presentation. So like I said, we're going to primarily talk about what neuropsychological evaluations look like because I find that's the most confusing for folks. And my goal in this part of the presentation is to give you a clearer understanding of what that looks like and what information you might be able to get out of that. So it'll look different at different clinics. I'll give you a little insight into what it looks like generally at the Family Institute, but every clinic's going to do it a little bit differently. But most places will have a lot of these elements. So generally, a neuropsych eval is going to be a 6 to 8 hour comprehensive evaluation. And the goal is really to help you understand your child's cognitive strengths and weaknesses, and how those strengths and weaknesses are connecting to their behavior. So, unlike just an interview and rating scales that are really going to look at the behavioral aspects of it, a neuropsych is going to look more comprehensively at the behavioral aspects, but also the cognitive aspects, learning, memory, executive functioning. I do want to build a little bit on what Dr. Austin was saying earlier. It is important when we work with kids to have a really holistic view of their experiences, their symptoms, and how that's manifesting for them. Historically, there have been racial and gender biases in ADHD diagnosis, both with underdiagnosis and overdiagnosis, as well as not getting an understanding of where the behaviors are coming from. And so, one of our goals in ADHD diagnoses is to take the child into account more holistically, gender, racial, past experiences, to get a better understanding of what's going on for them, because we know that early intervention can be a really helpful tool for children as they go through early development in the school system. Okay, so what is it gonna look like generally? So usually with neuropsych evaluations, we're gonna look at a number of different areas. First, we're gonna look at their cognitive profile, what is often referred to as IQ testing. Now, the sometimes people have questions about why is that necessary? For a lot of folks, it can be really helpful because it's a pretty common pattern. Not all individuals with ADHD, but for a lot of individuals with ADHD, they will present with weaker processing speed, so how they're taking in information and using it, or working memory, like Dr. Austin was saying earlier. So this is one of the ways that we um, learn about this, and that can be really helpful in informing our recommendations in the home and school setting. We take a look at verbal and visual learning and memory, so how kids are acquiring information and how they're able to hold on to it. Um, we are doing a deep dive into direct testing for attention. How do they do on a really boring task? Are they able to sustain their attention? Are they able to sit in their seat when they're feeling really bored or really tired or have a very challenging task? As well as executive functioning testing. How are they at switching between two different things? How are they at doing tasks efficiently? How are they at planning, organizing, those types of things? We also do social emotional testing, um, academic testing for kids that are struggling in school. What we want to rule out is make sure that there's not a learning disorder. Um, because if you're having a really hard time learning, or if a subject is feeling really challenging, that can certainly impact your attention or your ability to sit and listen to instruction. And then we're not occupational therapists, but we often do like to rule out any fine motor or visual motor concerns, so that we can recommend further testing by an occupational therapist if necessary. That's a lot of hours, right? 6 to 8 hours is a lot. We do give kids lots of breaks, especially, a 5-year-old's going to need more breaks than a 15-year-old generally. Um, but usually we're going to do this with a clinical interview, both with parents and the child. Those standardized tests that I was just referring to, lots of rating scales. This is often a way that we get input from the teachers as well. How are they actually performing in the school setting? And there's benefits to using these standardized tests to see how are they doing in comparison to an average peer their age. Because again, we all have some of those symptoms that Dr. Austin mentioned. It rises to the level of ADHD if it's much more than would be expected and it's having a functional impact on their lives. So once we gather all that information, the final step is taking all that information, integrating it into getting a better understanding of your child and interpreting the results. So for us, it's really important that we're not basing any diagnosis based on one single score or one single test. Um, we're getting multiple data points from multiple measures, discussions, observations of how the child is doing in the room with us, and information from the school setting, because it's going to be really important for us to be able to um, have confidence in our diagnosis that the data is really pointing to that. And if it's not clear, we have that discussion too, and how to intervene to help the child regardless. As Dr. Austin and I have already kind of alluded to, sometimes it's pretty straightforward whether the child is meeting criteria for ADHD. Sometimes it's pretty messy. Um, and so one of our goals is to take that holistic view of the child and get an understanding of, is that child having difficulty with attention because they've had trauma in their past, that they're so anxious that their mind is really on worries, that they're feeling really depressed, um, that they are working so hard cognitively to read a sentence that they lose the meaning along the way. So this more comprehensive evaluation can really give us some insight into where that difficulty with inattention is coming from. It is pretty common for kids with ADHD to have a co-occurring difficulty. Some of the most common difficulties that we see or presenting concerns that we see at the Family Institute include ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, specific learning disabilities. So if your child is having trouble in reading, writing, or math, especially if they've already received intervention. We want to look at and see if they're significantly below where we would expect them for their grade and age. Um, Trying to get a better understanding if a child has a trauma history, if that's impacting their attention, as well as trying to understand how different emotional concerns may be impacting their functioning, such as anxiety, depression, OCD, or other mood disorders. So following the evaluation, um, we have a 1 hour feedback session to review the results and do a deep dive into recommendations. So you receive a written report that documents your child's history up to that point, the quantitative information from the testing results, the summary, our diagnostic conclusions or impressions, and then recommendations for the home and school setting. It is a long report and it can be quite overwhelming. So we like to go through some of the highlights with folks to help make sense and really highlight what we think will be the most helpful information. We work under the assumption that you, as the parent, love your child and are doing the absolute best that you can for them. And we really hope that the information, and I think I'm speaking for most psychologists at other clinics as well, that it's useful in the day-to-day information or the day-to-day life of your child, but also your family, because we know that you impact your child impacts you, and we at the Family Institute really do like to think of kids and families holistically. Okay, so what do you do with all this information? I know I just gave a lot of information to you, so let's talk about you walk out of your final feedback session with the psychologist. What do you do with that? For a lot of folks, um, it's helpful to work with the school. And so, one thing I do like to highlight is there is a difference between receiving a medical diagnosis versus the educational classification system. So, this can be really confusing for parents because it is confusing. Um, that just because, let's say, your child gets a diagnosis of ADHD from their pediatrician, or from a neuropsych. They've they've checked the boxes, they meet criteria for an ADHD diagnosis. That doesn't mean that they're automatically going to qualify for a plan in the school setting. So, if you remember from my earlier slide, there's two things that must be true for the child. They must meet criteria for a disability, and there must be a demonstrated need in the school setting. And so, trying to work with the school to get your child's needs met as best as possible. The other thing that folks don't always know is schools have their own process to determine eligibility for one of the support plans that we're going to talk about. And so sometimes that's their own comprehensive evaluation. Sometimes it's a meeting with the team to just talk about what the student's needs are and if there are other ways to get those needs met besides special education. Generally, you're going to come across two types of plans to support students. Now, schools will often have other types of less formal plans, but these two are written into the law. So the first type of plan is called an individualized education program. This is what's commonly referred to as special education. If a child is meeting criteria for an IEP, it means that that child has a demonstrated need and needs specialized instruction. So they need something in terms of curriculum or instruction that's above and beyond what they're getting in the general or what is available in the general education classroom. So sometimes that may mean extra math intervention for students that are much more impacted. They may need a separate curriculum, but they need specialized instruction. The other thing that comes with an IEP is accommodations to access the curriculum. So these are going to be things more like extended time on tests, flexible seating, ability to take breaks, uh, things of that nature. Um, and so those types of plans include both. And again, the child needs to meet criteria for one of the 13 areas underneath the law, and they need to demonstrate a need for further instruction. The second type of plan that often gets talked about is a Section 504 accommodation plan. So, this is for a child that doesn't need specialized instruction, but they need accommodations to access the curriculum. So, for example, a student with a hearing impairment, they who doesn't have any cognitive weaknesses that can participate in the general education and curriculum. They don't need specialized instruction, but they may need equipment to access that education. They may need to sit closer to the front of the room so that they can read the teacher's lips more. These types of plans are pretty common for kids with ADHD or different social emotional concerns such as anxiety or depression, where they don't necessarily need specialized instruction, but they need those accommodations to access the curriculum. I put some language related to the language in the law. Um, and in order to meet criteria for this plan, an individual must have a physical or mental impairment that, and these are the key words, substantially limits one or more major life activities. So I gave some examples there, and you'll notice that on that last line, concentration, thinking, communicating, and working. So that's how a lot of kids will meet criteria who have ADHD or anxiety or depression. If you are going to pursue one of these plans, we recommend that you take the report, and if you feel comfortable sharing it with the school, that you share it with the school professionals and request in writing a meeting with the school to discuss your child's needs and explore their eligibility for a plan. So we do recommend that you put it in writing. Different schools will and different districts will have different um, procedures for this, but generally it's a safe bet to ask your child's teacher, contact the school psychologist, contact the special education administrator, or the school social worker. Even the folks at the front desk should be able to tell you what the process is and who the proper point person to talk to is. Okay. Um, this is very general bird's eye view, but in terms of ADHD treatment, there's a lot of nuances to how we're going to work with a child. Um, but, and it's very important to keep in mind the age of the child and the presenting concern. The American Academy of Pediatrics says that you can assess for ADHD as young as 4. Again, we're looking at the child's behavior in relation to their peers, and is it much different than what we would expect? Because 4-year-olds have a hard time sitting still. Pretty much every 4-year-old I've ever met. So really we're looking above and beyond what would be expected. So keeping in mind age and presenting concerns, often what we'll recommend is some sort of combination of individual work with the child, environmental supports. So you'll hear a lot about parent coaching, parent management training, and school supports. And what I say to parents all the time is you are not causing your child's difficulties. You are not responsible. And there's lots that you can do as a parent to support them in their behavior, their emotion regulation, and setting both the child and yourself up for success. Medication is a very personal choice for families and individuals, but that's often the third prong of the stool that we think about. Typically, and this is, there's exceptions to every rule, but typically we're going to start thinking about medication earliest at age 6. But it can be an important support for a lot of kids that are really struggling, especially with the impulsivity piece. There's lots, like I said, you are not causing your child distress, but there's lots that you can do as a parent to support them and support them gaining the skills. Because with ADHD, there are some definite vulnerabilities, but children are amazing and they are sponges. And especially with ADHD, it can be really helpful to have some structures in place. Another thing that we like to think about is ADHD does have, research shows and anecdotally, I can support that a lot of times there's a very heavy genetic component to ADHD. And so it's not uncommon for me to have a feedback session with parents and parents to say something like, that sounds familiar, or I was really like this as a child as well. And so parents and children may struggle, have similar strengths and weaknesses. And so learning about yourself and what works for you can be really helpful as well. What I always like to start with when I'm doing therapy is let's check in on lifestyle strategies. How is sleep going? Is the child getting enough nutrition throughout the day? Is their blood sugar spiking? Are they, hungry in the morning? Things like that. Are they getting enough water? Are they getting enough movement? Um, and movement that feels good for them, that is reinforcing that they enjoy. What are routines and structures looking like at home? Um, Can we create a more defined bedtime routine and checklist so that to support student or children in getting through that more efficiently? Um, what does emotional regulation look like in your household? A lot of times I like to talk about making the implicit explicit. So, can you talk about when you're using a calming tool? I'm feeling frustrated right now. I'm going to take 3 deep breaths. Um, that can be really powerful. Or I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm going to take a break right now and come back to this in 5 minutes after I've calmed down. Things like that. Being really intentional with your praise and what you're giving attention to. So, um, let's say a child cannot for the life of them remember to hang up their coat after school, right? And they do it one day. Really lay into that praise. Like, great job remembering to hang up your coat. That's really helpful that I didn't have to remind you. Things like that. And then managing expectations. Really understanding what your child's strengths and challenges are can help you mold your behavior to help them meet those expectations. So, the activity that we did at the beginning, it's a lot to hold that information. It's a lot when you're feeling overwhelmed, and a lot of us as humans will shut down. So, learning strategies like avoiding multi-step directions or helping your child break really big tasks into smaller, more manageable steps. And then finally, a plug for taking care of yourself as a parent. I know we hear this word self-care a lot in our society, but you can't pour from an empty cup. And so making sure that you are taking care of your needs as well um, can go a long way. So we have some of our favorite resources, lots to explore on these resources, and I believe we will be sending those out with the recording at the end of or after the presentation is over. All right. So we have some questions in the chat that we're going to start off by addressing. We do encourage you to put more questions in the Q&A box. We're probably not going to be able to get to all of the questions, um, but we'll try our best in the next 10 minutes or so. All right. So our first question. How do I tell that my child's emotion dysregulation is driven by ADHD rather than going through hormonal changes? Ooh, that is a really excellent question. Um, so I guess the long and the short of it is it can be really hard, even with this comprehensive evaluation. Unfortunately, our technology is not at the point where we can do a simple blood test or we can do an X-ray or a CT of the brain and be able to definitively tell you what's going on. Um, what we can say, especially, and I don't know if the person who asked this question, if their child, it sounds like, is probably going through puberty. It's one of the things that we keep in mind. What are the biological needs of the child? And that's where the second question in the chat, why is 12 and younger the age that's focused on for diagnosis? Um, those questions are kind of related. What we're really looking for is a pattern of behaviors or a history. So that's one of the reasons we look to the earlier ages to see, was this a child that was climbing on furniture as a kid? Was this a child that was a daydreaming kid? Um, and trying to take all of that information into account to try and get a sense of, did this just start happening around when the child started experiencing puberty? Then that gives us more evidence that this is probably more hormonal or experiential than a true neural developmental difference. So a lot of folks have probably heard the term neurodivergent or neurodiversity. That refers to um, That's an umbrella term that refers to a number of different disorders that fit under that umbrella that speak to neurodevelopmental differences. So commonly, some of the ones that go under that are ADHD, autism, specific learning disorders. Um, all individuals under that umbrella have amazing brains. There's absolutely nothing wrong with their brains or them, but they just may have some neurological differences or neurodevelopmental differences um, that don't tend to just start as kids get older. Usually, we can see evidence from a young age. One final thing before I see if Dr. Austin has anything to add to that. Um, Sometimes it can be confusing because, especially if a child has a lot of cognitive strengths, they may not have as obvious impairments when they're younger. So, especially for really bright kids or kids that do have some strong social skills, or if demands are lower in school, they're able to compensate pretty well. But a lot of times, what we see is as kids get older and the demands, um, increase, we see those executive functioning deficits and the ability to kind of keep up with their peers become harder and harder. So, like Dr. Austin said earlier, it's not that you can't get the diagnosis after um, age 12, but that's why the interview is really important and the questionnaires that we send out to get a better sense of what was this individual like as a child, were we starting to see some of those impairments? Anything you would add, Dr. Austin?
So I think that was a really great explanation. And I think kind of what we notice is that if we don't see inattention or hyperactivity prior to 12, right, then it likely is probably related to something else. And so we kind of hold that in mind.
Okay, probably have time for a couple more. The next question is how to support a child with ADHD that's experiencing social rejection at school? Wow, that's a great question that we're not going to be able to answer comprehensively in the next 4 minutes or so, but um, there's every child is different, but some common patterns that we see is some of those difficulties with attention, executive functioning, or impulsivity can create challenging social dynamics. So if you have let's say, a kid that meets criteria for ADHD, hyperactive, impulsive type, that might be a kid that's interrupting a lot. That might be a child that's having a hard time listening to their friends and engaging in a back and forth conversation. Um, that may be a child that's having a lot of trouble with emotion regulation and having really big emotional reactions to things that their peers may be able to stay regulated through. Um, and so part of what a recommendation often will be is for the child to engage in some therapy to address what their needs are, and to gain an awareness of their strengths, and then also to have an understanding of how their behavior may be impacting others. Again, not blaming the child, but understanding that if you're in other kids' faces all the times or cutting them off, that they might not like that. So, how can you slow down your brain, slow down your body? I think the other thing that I would um, think about is the environmental support. So that might be a child that needs more explicit social skills intervention or work with them. Um, and that also might be a child that needs more support from the adults in their environment. So, it's kind of a multi-pronged approach. Anything you would add, Dr. Austin?
No, I agree. And I think um, if you feel comfortable partnering with the school, right, to kind of think about ways that the teachers can be really supporting these social relationships as well, I think can be really important.
Okay. Um, Another question that we have is about lifestyle interventions. Um, so, okay. Again, that's a really big question. So if your child is working with a therapist, most child therapists that I know or have worked with are enthusiastic about working with the parents as well, to help them think about some ways to add structure and support in the home setting. And so, or, let's say a child is having trouble going to bed before midnight, and a lot of teens are. So also just keeping that in mind. Um, how how as a parent can you support your child in learning why that's important, and what helpful supports can you put in place? That the phone goes in the parents' room starting at 11:30 or things like that. Things that you may not be thinking about, um, because a lot of times what I say to folks is nobody hands you a manual when you have a child. And when a child comes into your life, and even if they did hand you a parenting manual, it probably wouldn't be that helpful because every kid is so different. And so, really understanding where your child is struggling, and then figuring out appropriate supports. And I'm sure that's probably too vague of an answer to be satisfying. So I apologize to whoever asked that question. But it really is so individualized to the child that that's kind of hard to answer in 2 minutes. Anything you would add, Dr. Austin?
No, I think, like you said, right, I think it's so individualized, right, that it's really specific to each child and what they specifically need to feel their best and what feels great and good for their family too.
Yeah. So I hope some of the takeaways from today as we wrap up is that you're not alone, that there's, lots of things that you can do to support your child and to learn about your child's strengths and challenges, um, and that your child's brain is awesome no matter what's going on with it. So thank you so much for joining us today. And, at the Family Institute, we're here to support you, whether that's assessment needs or therapeutic needs. And we hope that everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thanks.